Like Peter Hitchens, furniture retailers, carpet stores, they were torched on Monday night, Sunday night as well. No bookshops. What does this tell us about modern Britain?
Well, it tells you that they were simply doing what they were doing for fun. They saw a furniture store, they reckoned it would burn. Riots are fun. People riot to enjoy themselves. They don't riot because they have grievance. They don't riot because they've had unhappy childhoods. They riot because they are wicked, selfish, lawless, and absolutely unable to recognise authority or the difference between right and wrong. We have raised a generation of people like that. On Monday night and Tuesday night, they came out into the open because they saw an opportunity. That's all you need to discuss here. And what we have done is dismantled every form of authority in our society during the past 50 years with deliberate intent. The left-wing liberal reformers who have run our society have attacked every single institution from the family to the school and reduced it to nothing. They've eviscerated the police. We talk now about tough sentences. There doesn't exist such a thing as a tough sentence in our society. These people will not be punished. Most of the people who are in the courts now are in any case stragglers. They're not the real deal. They're the people who were picked up at the end who were too stupid to run away. There will be no serious criminal justice. These people know that. Most of them have encountered. When I was in the court at Highbury yesterday, several of the people who were up before the magistrates already had long strings of offences to their name. Okay, one was actually on a suspended prison sentence. These people have encountered authority again and again and again, and they find it laughable. And they're right to find it laughable because it is laughable.
Very shortly.
David do nothing to them.
I think Peter Hitchens was referring to some of your friends when we talked about liberal left-wing types. And I was making a slightly flippant point about bookshops, but my point was more serious in the sense that they were breaking into shops where they could cart stuff off, or in certain instances where they even couldn't. But they weren't looting
certainly,
bookshops.
I mean, we know from the intercepted messages that some of them are saying there's an enormous amount of money to be got. I mean, there does seem to have been some fairly well organised kind of gang operations and messages sent about where you could get more money. Some of these things were also just opportunist fire setting. I mean, if you go around near where I live in Chalk Farm, there are a couple of places put through that have absolutely no economic value whatsoever. You just did it because that's where you were at the moment you felt like breaking a window. But first thing, there is not a generation, Peter, of lawless people who do not understand the law and who have the characteristics you're talking about. Right. There does not exist such a generation. That generation is not characterised by the people who were writing. It's really important, this. Nor is it characterised by people who are the children of one-parent families, the vast majority of whom don't do this kind of thing and so on. We're talking about something very specific and very particular here, and I think we've got to kind of nail that one down rather than going as general as you wish to be.
I'm not being general. I'm being totally specific. I could name you the acts of Parliament. I could name you the decisions taken.
Gentlemen,
it won't be because of the divorce law.
From divorce reform onwards. Yes, absolutely. If you want specific, I can do specific. It was done as a huge tide of reform, beginning under the Wilson government in the 1960s and continued ever since. Listen, it has had a devastating effect. And to sit there and say there is no such group of people, they've just shown themselves to us.
No, I said
they've shown themselves to us all over the country for what they are.
Four people on this panel. Let's get the views of Sheldon Thomas on this. I want to address this idea, and both Peter and David have, in a sense, tried to explore this. If you're a young man, young woman growing up on people don't like the phrase, a sink estate in South London, your mother, your father, maybe they've never worked, maybe their grandparents never did, welfare dependency, inherited, no culture of work. There's a hopelessness in that situation, isn't there?
Most definitely hopelessness, and I would go as far as to say this, that many of the guys that we're working with have already told me it seems like we're in a society that cares more about material goods. We've seen in the last 4 or 5 days everybody go up in arms about material goods that's been burnt, people's been robbed. I'm going to tell you something. In the last 2 to 3 years in London, we've had 20 murders. 20 murders. I have not seen Boris Johnson, David Cameron, or the past government even go as far as to say, let's have a debate as to why we have 14-year-olds capping each other, shooting each other, and let's even draw it a bit further. We've got girls that are being gang raped, and we're sitting there worried about some shops. Now, don't get me wrong, I disrespect anybody that's burnt that man's shop down and goes around attacking. I'm not into no violence and looting, but let me tell you something straight. Young kids that we're working with are annoyed that all we want to do is sit here and have a big debate, not this particular debate, but have a big debate around the country about how they've looted. But we've had murders Murdered.
Okay,
Has your
hold it.
paper
No, Sheldon,
had a big
Sheldon,
write
Peter,
up
hold fire.
about it?
Ruth is desperate to get in.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Ruth is
I
desperate.
think you're
As the only
completely
woman on the
No,
panel,
I'm
I'd
not
really
completely wrong.
like
No, I
to
think
speak, and I'd like to actually back up what you've got to say, because actually speaking to the young people in Manchester today, the overriding point was how many young people have died, been murdered, and there's not the same level of outrage.
No way.
And it took for the country to burn, and therefore to impinge on middle-class people, for people to be so worried about social values.
Okay.
But no,
Well, the case of Damilola Taylor,
Peter,
the case of Damilola Taylor, for
You
instance,
cannot
the
dispute
papers were
that.
full of
That is
it.
true.
Sheldon.
20 murders. Answer me the question on 20 murders.
Peter,
My
Ruth.
point, let me just finish my point.
Finish your point, then we've
Thank
got
you.
another
Yes,
guest coming in,
okay.
please.
The point I'm making is I'm talking about young people's perceptions. That's what they're saying to us. And the point is there's a massive disconnect between what the young people understand and possibly the reality of the situation. But we are not showing that these young people who we're calling the underclass today, for example, are part of our
You've
society.
proved to me, Ruth, you don't need me to
People
stand
have-
up for you.
people have
Perfectly capable
died
of
in
doing
these
yourself.
events.
Peter, just hold on a tick, because joining us now from Westminster is the Vice Chair of the Metropolitan Police Federation. That's John Tully, who's been working in Gold Command over the last week. I imagine a pretty busy place. John, do you accept we need less of a police service, more of a police force?
Good evening. It's a very difficult debate you're having there, and I think a lot of criticism has been levelled at the police service over the last few days around the level of response that we've given to the disturbances. It's a bit of a damned if you do and damned if you don't situation, really, because we've been criticised in the past for being too heavy-handed, and on other occasions for not being heavy-handed enough. So it's a bit of a deep blue sea out there for us at the moment.
Do you resent perhaps some of those rules that have, those rules of engagement which have made it too difficult for police to go in hard, as it were?
I think what we're after is more direction from senior politicians around what they actually mean when they say they want the streets cleared. Do they want us to go in hard? And if we do, will they back us up when we do so?
As a police officer, I don't know how many years you've given to your policing career, or how strong you feel that sense of vocation. Let's assume you feel it very strongly. How do you feel when you hear, as we did this week, that on Amazon sales of baseball bats had absolutely rocketed because people no longer trust the police to protect their homes and their families?
Well, that's absolutely disgraceful. I've been a police officer for 26 years, and it is a vocation so far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure the great majority of my colleagues feel the same way. We can't have vigilante groups ruling the street. They cannot take the law into their own hands. They must leave it to the professionals.
One thing you can have is justice being seen to be done, can't you? With the emphasis, I emphasise the word seen. We saw people this morning going in and out of court. Often they're in court being terribly polite, they come out rather less polite. All of them, most of them, reluctant to be pictured by the cameras. They're not being publicly shamed because we can't see them. We give them that option, don't we? If we had cameras in court, they wouldn't have that option.
That's correct, and I issued a press statement on behalf of the Metropolitan Police Federation this morning, calling for the government to look thoroughly at the criminal justice system. We must have proportionate sentences for the crimes. We had people being released this morning after having served 2 days in prison, so in police cells rather, and the sentence was time served for rioting and looting. That's absolutely outrageous. Mr. Cameron was quoted as saying the punishment should fit the crime. It certainly isn't doing so at the moment.
John Tully, thanks very much indeed. Ruth, I'm going to give you the first bite at this. Policing, sentencing policy, a lot of people are looking hard at it now. There is a popular view, rightly or wrongly, that a lot of these young people will get a rap on the knuckles, particularly if they're kids. And we know that even today there was an 11-year-old appearing in court in Nottingham, an 11-year-old, that the sentencing will not do the job, or a sufficient enough job to deter people from doing this sort of thing again.
Well, I firmly believe that the work should be done before we get to the point of sentencing or deciding what to do for a sentence for an 11-year-old. If the same amount of focus was put on what initiatives can go on, what can work, who can we work with these young people, we know who they are, we know who needs the support in the communities, why are we not putting the work in beforehand? It's completely the wrong way around.
David Aronovich, we were talking about an outbreak, John Tully was talking about an outbreak of potential vigilantism. We saw an outbreak of volunteerism, didn't we, in parts of London, certainly, where people said, OK, we're going to clear up this mess.
I mean, there have been some sort of interesting byproducts, and that's the most encouraging aspect of it. Then there's the kind of medium aspect of it, like the Turkish guys who defended their area of Dalston. You thought that's good for them, but you wouldn't necessarily want to see it on a kind of full-time basis and so on. But when people are frightened, that's what they do. We notice that the Sikh community has a lot of cricket bats very quickly available to it. And I think there's something of some of the aspects of the spirit of volunteerism, obviously, which we want to see carry on, which is the people taking responsibility for their own area. It was a very, very big shock for us to discover that gangs of youths could go around parts of city centres, etc., stoving in and setting things on fire, and the police weren't there. It was this is the thing that I'm worried about more than anything else, which is the shock of that will send us into doing things which maybe are ill-considered or not very well thought through. I'm looking at some of the sentences. Some of the sentences are actually pretty stern. I mean, there's one guy who nicked some water from Lidl's. He shouldn't have been there. He's an absolute idiot, etc. £3.50. He's got 4-month sentence. Now, that is certainly an exemplary sentence. Whether or not it'll do him any good, I have no idea.
There are going to be some long sentences. There's no question of it, because a lot of these cases are being referred to the Crown Court for precisely that reason. They will appear long, but of course every sentence that's passed by our courts is a fraud because it's automatically halved when it's passed. And then after that they're released early anyway, and what's more, they'll mostly be the wrong people, as we've earlier discussed. What I would not like to hear from the police anymore, though, thank you very much, is stuff about taking the law into your own hands. Who does the law belong to? It's ours in the first place. We give it to them so that they can exercise it on our behalf. When and where they fail, and on this matter they have substantially failed, they can't really complain if groups of residents of streets take up their own defence. And I really do think there should be less of this, and it's been for a long time, people who've tried to defend themselves against burglars have been hauled in by the police and charged with offences. It ought to stop. It ought to stop for good, this nonsense. We ought to be allowed to defend ourselves a lot more if they can't do it for us.
But in many communities, before this whole uprising or riot happened, communities were complaining about the lack of police anyway, long before all of this. And I go back to Ruth's point about we seem to be forgetting that. To me, I don't look at this as an enforcement problem. I really don't. I actually look at this as a whole community breakdown and the government breakdown, because I actually think some of the policies that this government has passed has actually created this environment, and I think the community not facing some of the problems they've had to face, missing fathers and bad education, and teenage pregnancy and all of those things, I think those two are the main contributing factors. The police are here to do enforcement. They're not here to do social work or anything like that. And I think that sometimes the government likes to blame somebody and the community likes to blame somebody, but I think the two parties need to look at each other before, and that's when we can start beginning to get
Sheldon,
a solution.
We've done enough